My name is Kartchner, April 17, 2020, 4 p.m.
Okay, what was life like for you? What was life like for your family growing up surrounded by the Vietnam War physically?
Physically, I didn't really, really know, and I'm not sure if my family was really affected physically by the war. That isn't to say that, as again, my oldest brother, who's 5 years older than me, he would have been affected, and I know that my dad was, as my oldest brother was approaching draft age in 1970, 1971, and my father was quite concerned that he would be drafted. As my father, although highly conservative, was not at all in favor of the war.
What was life like for your family growing up surrounded by the Vietnam War mentally?
Mentally, that's probably, again, physically, I don't think I was old enough, and it didn't affect me personally enough in that sense. But to your second question, I think that's probably the better question to have answered. That is, mentally, my father was quite stressed out, and there's rumors in our family. At least I heard them once, and I probably ought to check with my dad that he was actually anticipating moving to another country, Australia, simply because, again, as conservative and Republican as he is, he could not see the justification for 56,000 young men to die in Vietnam, which is the final number, give or take. So mentally, it was a stress for my dad and my mom. I had to check with Dad to see to what degree. Anyway,
How did it personally affect you?
I don't. The only one time it really affected me, and I'm not sure if. Well, I'll just tell you. I remember one experience where I saw the firsthand tragedy of the Vietnam War. And there was also another one which I didn't realize till later. And I'll do the second one first. I was in 5th or 6th grade, maybe 7th grade, and we had a music teacher. I think his name was Mr. Cheeseman. Yeah, Mr. Cheeseman. And it was a singing class, not a band. And singing class, he would teach us songs to sing, and we would just sing away. And I still remember some of the songs. And I realize now, and I still remember 2 or 3 of the songs, but I realize now as an adult, they were all anti-war songs. Mr. Cheeseman was obviously not a fan of the war, and I still remember Billy Don't Be a Hero. We used to sing that with great gusto, and I realize now it was an anti-Vietnam War song. And there's another couple songs that I remember singing. What's that? Tony Orlando and Don, Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree, another anti-Vietnam War song. So that was a memory I had quite clearly about during that time of the war. The second one that I remember then, and it was quite sad, that was in my church we had something called home teaching, where you and a companion, you go visit 2 or 3, 4 families once a month just to see how they're doing. A gentleman in the ward, which is a ecclesiastical geographical area, this gentleman, and his name was Smiley Matthews, Harold Matthews. He's always smiling. We would go visit a family called, it was the Coons family. And they were a very quiet couple, probably at the time in their 60s. And I remember when we'd go visit them for about an hour or so, we would, Brother Matthews would do most of the talking, because again, I was 7 or 8 years old. And I remember at that time 15 maybe, 14, 15, I don't recall. Um, but as Brother Matthews and Brother Coons and Sister Coons would sit there and talk about adult stuff, which was just boring as can be, of course, I would just look around the room in their living room in their house, and on one of the walls there were some candles lit and a picture of a young man I'd never seen before. I knew some of the Coons boys. That family was about a half generation ahead of us. So the oldest kids in their family, if I were 15, they were probably 30, 35. And their youngest son, Steve Coons, I just remembered his name, he was the youngest one in their family, and he was my oldest brother's age. So I knew him a little bit only because he knew my oldest brother. Um, so the guy in the picture on the wall by the candles that were always lit, if I recall correctly, I don't know who he was. You could tell he was a member of their family, one of their boys, because he just looked like the rest of the older Coons brothers. I don't know who eventually told me. I think it was my mom or my dad, probably my mom, when I asked about that picture, and she said that he had died in the Vietnam War. And he had not necessarily wanted to go to war. He was drafted. And when he was drafted and he was conscripted into the war, um, you learn a specialty in the war. And his specialty, he became a medic. And apparently the very first, and then once you train them here in the States, and they ship you off to Vietnam. And he was assigned to some platoon, I suppose. And from what my mom told me at the time, what the medics do, and they have pistols on them, but essentially their job is to, when somebody's wounded, they go help them, pull them off the battlefield, and do what it takes. Apparently, the very first foray they had out into the fields, they were ambushed by the Viet Cong, and he was killed. The very first month he was in Vietnam, and Brother and Sister Coons apparently never got over it, which I don't know how you could get over it, but to the point where they kept what was essentially a shrine there in their living room. And my mom said that they were never the same. They're always quiet, good people, but they just lost a positive spark in their life. And when you consider the fact that the Vietnam War ended with us, it's not that we surrendered, but we lost. To this day, Vietnam is controlled by the Viet Cong. I mean, and the pictures you see of the helicopter leaving the embassy with people just trying to get out of there, and all those tens of thousands of young men dead, for what? And I don't think the Coons ever, to this, and now they both passed away, never got over it.
Were you scared your family members would get drafted? How did that take a toll on you?
It didn't take a toll on me because I wasn't affected personally, but as I mentioned, and I think it's probably something I would like to talk with my dad. If not sure if he has any desire to talk about it, but if you would have asked me, because again, my memories of my dad when I was a kid, staunchly conservative, and you would have thought that he was completely in favor of war, in the sense that you have to do what you have to do to safeguard your freedoms, etc. But I'm sure that he was thinking, because the war was not a Democrat-Republican thing. The war was started under by Lyndon Johnson really exacerbated the war, and is followed by President Nixon, a Republican. So, but yeah, my dad was greatly affected because he didn't agree with the war, Not certainly not the Vietnam War, and the thought that he would send his oldest son, my brother Brian, to fight halfway across the world, and for what? Um, he struggled with that big time. It's not like it's World War II or World War One, where you can clearly define we're fighting for certain ideals, certain freedoms. And my dad's position was Vietnam does not represent that to me. So he struggled with it big time.
If you can remember, what was the economy like during the war?
Ooh, again, um, I was young enough that I didn't have to worry about putting food on the table, that sort of thing. It reminds me of when my dad is asked about the Depression. He says, when you grew up in a small Mormon farm in southern Arizona, you don't even know the Depression's going on because you have the chickens and the cows and the pigs and the crops to and the gardens to provide your own food. So the price goes up and down. If you're on a farm, somebody says, "Well, did you get through the Depression?" You say, well, "I don't know. It was life." And so for me, I didn't even. I look back now, and the economy was. Whenever there's a war, the economy tends to rev up because the war machine requires a lot of people, and so a lot of people are hired to manufacture. But it was right at the end of the war in the early 70s when I do remember inflation started to skyrocket. And on the one hand, and I remember as an older teenager, you could get certificates of deposit, which today you can get them for half of 1%. That's all you can get. In those days, you can get a CD for uh, 15, 16%, which is just amazing. Except when you look at your mortgage on your house, today you're paying 3.5%. In those days, you would have been paying a mortgage with interest rates of 18, 19, 20%. Brutal. So once the war wrapped up, we entered the 70s where inflation started to take off. Jimmy Carter was president. Um, and there were, more than a few things, like when OPEC cut oil production, so gas prices were skyrocketing. And I do remember the lines at the end of the war, the lines to get gas for your vehicle. There'd be like a line of 20 cars, and you just sit there and a little by little. Today we don't see that at all.
Looks like you've answered this before, but were your parents for or against the war?
Specifically the Vietnam War, I can't imagine that they would be anything but against the war. Again, it's bad enough you're going to send your son or your daughter to die, possibly. That's bad enough. It's uh, when it's not done for the right reason or there's no purpose other than politicians against. I'm sure they were against the war.
Did you have anyone close to you that served in the war?
Um, I don't know about close. I knew some in our ward. My uncle Jerry, he's passed away now. He was a colonel and he served in the war, but he was obviously as a colonel he was once he retired from the military after 20 years, he then became a teacher at the St. David High School. It's a small, tiny high school in southern Arizona. Even then, he required all the kids to refer to him as Colonel, and most of them did. A teacher at high school, so he was proud of his service. I'm not sure. I never did ask him if he was in favor of the war. He probably would have said he was, simply because when you follow orders, you're loyal to the institution.
So the follow-up question is, how did they react when they got home?
Well, that's kind of strange as well, because you see in all the movies, and you saw the soldiers coming back looking like a bunch of hippies and marching in the streets and all that stuff, and how they were all affected with PTSD, etc., etc. But for example, I think people that went into the war that had the support of their families, like my uncle Jerry, he continued in the military when he came back. He can for another 10 years. I think he was. Plus, he never drank, and never took drugs. So when he came back from the war, I think he was far more well adjusted to life after the military, after the war, as opposed to perhaps others.
Did he have any war symptoms when he got home?
I didn't notice anything. And again, he very well could have. Maybe late at night he would wake up in a sweat and or whatever with bad memories, but he would talk about the war, not in great detail, but it's not something he tried to avoid, and I never noticed anything about that that would say that he was really struggling.
Looks like you answered this earlier, but did you have any neighbors or acquaintances that died in the war?
Yeah, just that one that I was aware of, Steve Kuhn's older brother. Just a tragedy. He's buried in Pomerane, where my mom's buried, and just think a life of a young man in his early 20s, 1 month after getting to Vietnam, shot dead, and an entire life of memories and a family and kids and grandkids at this point, and probably great grandkids, um, never realized. Just a body lying in the ground.
What was one of the unexpected benefits of the Vietnam War?
Ah, I do think that the Vietnam War, as well as the civil rights, in other words, the 60s, um, in spite of the fact that I think that um, some protesters went too far. I do think that the Vietnam War was healthy in a sense where people could stand up finally and question political leadership in D.C. saying, because we always look at World War II as America's finest generation, where you were proud to sign up and go fight in Europe or in the Pacific theater. Um, if you didn't go to the war, if you didn't go to war in World War II, you were considered to be disloyal. The Korean War, which my dad was in, I wasn't born yet. I don't really have a lot of memories of that, obviously. But the Vietnam War is when people were, I think, for the first time saying, wait a minute, why exactly are tens of thousands of young men dying and for what purpose? It was no longer enough that the politicians in D.C. would say, well, we need to send 30,000 more people to Vietnam or to Laos or who knows where to die. I think it's the positive thing out of that war was why exactly. And I think it's a healthy conversation to have, and that we're still having.
What was the resolution of the Vietnam War?
Well, again, the biggest memory I have, because when people say, why on earth were we actually there in Vietnam? You give me 10 people off the street, get a map and say, how many of you can point out where Vietnam is? 9 out of 10 or 10 out of 10 would have absolutely no idea. So the question is, why on earth were we even there? Mm-hmm. And all it was a proxy war. A proxy is when you're doing something on behalf of somebody else, that we're doing it. For example, what did we have against the Vietnamese? Again, we don't even know where they are. But the communists had taken over Vietnam and they were supported by the Soviet Union. We were there. Essentially, Vietnam was about us against the Soviet Union. We're fighting for the freedoms that we understand in the United States against the communists of Vietnam, essentially against the communists of Soviet Union. So, the memory that if you look on Google, you'll see that once we realized we were losing and the Viet Cong, they were just taking over the entire country because it was separated at that point in North Vietnam and South Vietnam. South Vietnam was where we were in power. North Vietnam was which is up by the border of the Soviet Union. That was pure communist. And slowly and steadily, they were taking over South Vietnam, which is why if you look on a map now on a globe, there is no North Vietnam and South Vietnam. It's Vietnam because they won. And when they came down to the capital, you look at the most famous iconic picture, that's the United States Embassy when the communists, the North Vietnamese, had taken over even the capital, and they were outside banging on the gates of the U.S. Embassy. And the last few dozen people in the embassy, including some Vietnamese people that had been in the South Vietnamese military, and there's one more helicopter over the embassy with a ladder down and people trying to get on. Otherwise, they would end up in concentration camps or just killed right there. And they were actually, you can see there's a dozen or so that they just couldn't, there's not enough room in the chopper, and they were left to be killed. And once that chopper left, we have never had any power over Vietnam to this day. It's still, for all intents and purposes, a communist country. They won.
Did school teachers try to preach towards or against the war?
Again, I just remember Mr. Cheeseman. Billy, don't be a... He wrote a song about somebody, a girl, telling the guy her boyfriend had just been drafted. Don't be a hero over there. Keep your head low. And what happens at the end of the song? She gets word that he was killed. Pretty sad. That's the only memory I have of somebody being staunchly for, pro, or con against the war is when Mr. Cheeseman would teach us anti-war songs and we didn't even know it.
Did your family look at Vietnamese people harshly after the war?
We didn't know any of them, and I don't think that my parents had a problem either way. I think they, again, we grew up in a very small rural town. I don't think there were any Vietnamese there. And again, you look on a map, we don't know anything about Vietnam. Again, when you understand that it wasn't against the Vietnamese, it was against the Soviet Union.
Were there any athletes against the war?
The only one that I recall, and I'm sure there were more than a few, but the most famous one was Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay. He was heavyweight champion of the world, and he got drafted. And his response was, I'm not going. He, I don't know if he filed for, what was the phrase, a conscientious objector, or where you want to be put if you could really, I don't remember the exact term. Some fled to Canada, but they stripped his titles for like 2 or 3 years. He wasn't able to box. And when they asked him, why are you objecting? And I forget what was his famous remark? Something about the effect that no Vietnamese or no Viet Cong, or they've never discriminated against me, because, and I'm paraphrasing, because he was saying, I've been discriminated as black my entire life here in the United States. Now you, the people that have been discriminating against me, want me to go clear across the world to a country I don't even know who they are and give my life? Why? What's the cause? And I think, and again, for 2 or 3 years, he was stripped of all his titles, couldn't box. He eventually did come back, took over his crown again, won his titles back. But yeah, that was like 2 or 3 years of his peak career. He's the one that I remember the most.
Okay, thanks, Dad.
You bet.